Story number 1. The invitation arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning. Its gold-embossed lettering caught my eye the moment I sifted through the pile of bills and junk mail. Class of 2010, Reunion Night, it read. Beneath it, a date and location, both strangely unfamiliar. The old gymnasium of our high school had been replaced with a name I didn't recognize. The Glass Hall, Midwich Woods. It was odd, but curiosity got the better of me. Nostalgia has a way of softening the edges of the past, doesn't it? I'd long buried the memories of high school, along with the people who once filled its corridors. Yet here I was, gripping that invitation tighter than I'd admit to anyone. The rain pounded against my apartment window as I sat down to reread it, the flickering streetlights outside casting shadows on the walls. Why now? I murmured to no one in particular. It had been 15 years, after all. I hadn't spoken to most of them since graduation. Even then, I wasn't exactly close with anyone. I'd always been the observer, blending into the background while others thrived in the limelight. Then there was the name, the Glass Hall. Something about it didn't sit right. It wasn't just unfamiliar. It was deliberately cryptic. Midwich Woods wasn't a place any of us ever ventured into. It was the stuff of whispered rumors, half-remembered warnings from parents, and old urban legends about people who wandered in but never came out. I should have tossed the invitation right there. But against better judgment, I kept reading. A night to reconnect, it promised, to remember the ties that bind us. A single line at the bottom sealed my decision to attend. All survivors welcome. The word survivors lingered in my mind like a bad aftertaste. What was it supposed to mean? It wasn't like we'd endured anything traumatic, at least nothing public. But high school was its own kind of war zone, wasn't it? The cliques, the rumors, the betrayals. Maybe we were survivors in a way. I called my friend Marcus, who I hadn't spoken to in years. "You got this invitation too, right?" I asked the moment he picked up. "Yeah," he replied, his voice carrying an unease that mirrored my own. "And I'm guessing you're as confused about it as I am." "Confused isn't the word I'd use," I said, pacing the room. "What's with the location? Do you know anything about it?" There was a pause, then a heavy sigh. "Look, I wasn't going to bring this up, but do you remember Emily?" The question hit me like a cold gust of wind. Of course I remembered Emily. Everyone did. She was the girl who vanished during our senior year. No one ever figured out what happened to her, and the rumors ranged from tragic accidents to something far darker. "Why?" I asked, my voice steady but my stomach tightening. "Her name's on the RSVP list," Marcus said. "And so are a few others who, well, didn't exactly make it to graduation." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I turned the invitation over in my hands, noticing something I'd missed before, a faint watermark, just visible under the right light. It was a symbol I didn't recognize, a circle divided by jagged lines, almost like shattered glass. "Do you think it's some kind of sick joke?" Marcus pressed. "Or something worse," I muttered. The rain outside had stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the storm itself. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that attending the reunion wasn't just about nostalgia. It was about answers. And maybe, just maybe, closure. The drive to Midwich Woods was uneventful at first. The highway stretched endlessly, hemmed in by tall trees that turned the world around me into a blur of dark green and black. My car's radio crackled with static. No stations, no music, just the occasional burst of white noise that made the silence all the more oppressive. I kept glancing at the directions printed on the back of the invitation, wondering why the address didn't show up on any GPS apps. It was almost as if the location had been deliberately erased, leaving nothing but vague coordinates and a warning not to trust the turnoffs. When I finally reached the forest's edge, the road narrowed into a single lane, its pavement cracked and overgrown with weeds. I turned onto it cautiously, my headlights slicing through the dark. The deeper I went, the more the air seemed to change, thicker, colder, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and rotting leaves. The glass hall emerged from the shadows without warning. One moment, there was nothing but trees and darkness. The next, the building loomed ahead like a mirage. It wasn't glass at all despite its name. The structure was a mix of concrete and steel, its walls covered in reflective panels that caught the moonlight and fractured it into jagged shards. I parked the car and stepped out, shivering as the night air wrapped around me. A handful of vehicles were scattered in the makeshift lot, Marcus's beat-up sedan among them. The rest were unfamiliar, but something about them felt off. They weren't old or damaged, but they looked as though they belonged to another era. "Hey, you made it!" Marcus's voice startled me as he appeared from the shadows, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. His usual sarcasm was absent, replaced by a tension that mirrored my own. "Yeah," I said, glancing around. "This place gives me the creeps." "Join the club." Marcus gestured toward the building. "Come on, everyone's inside." The moment we stepped through the heavy doors, I felt it, a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The glass hall's interior was a disorienting maze of mirrored walls and dim lighting. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound bouncing off the reflective surfaces until it felt like the room itself was alive. The crowd was small, fewer than 20 people, but familiar faces stood out among them. There was Carla, the former cheer captain whose social media had gone silent years ago. James, the class clown who'd always been too loud for his own good. And Rachel, who'd once been Emily's best friend. "What is this?" I whispered to Marcus as we made our way toward the group. He didn't answer right away, his eyes scanning the room with barely concealed unease. Finally, he leaned in and muttered, "Have you noticed something? No one's talking about the location. It's like they're avoiding the subject entirely." Before I could respond, a voice cut through the murmurs. "Welcome, everyone." A man stood at the center of the room, his sharp suit and confident posture giving him an air of authority. I didn't recognize him, but there was something unsettlingly familiar about his face, like a shadow of someone I'd once known. "My name is Mr. Whitaker," he said, his tone smooth yet clipped. "And I'd like to thank you all for attending this special reunion." Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside me. "What the hell is this?" he muttered under his breath. As if on cue, the lights flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When they returned, Mr. Whitaker's smile had faded. "Tonight is not just about reconnecting. It's about confronting the past." A chill ran through the room. Not a supernatural one, but the kind that comes with unspoken truths clawing their way to the surface. "What do you mean by that?" Rachel's voice broke the silence, her words laced with suspicion. Whitaker's eyes gleamed. "Every one of you left something behind in Midwich, secrets, lies, regrets. Tonight you'll have the chance to face them." His words hung in the air like a challenge. I glanced around and noticed the unease spreading among the group. Carla's hands trembled as she clutched her drink. James shifted his weight from foot to foot, avoiding eye contact. "This isn't funny," Marcus said, his voice louder now. "If this is some kind of sick game..." Whitaker raised a hand, silencing him. "It's not a game," he said softly, "but it is a test." Before anyone could respond, the doors slammed shut behind us, their echo reverberating through the hall like a finality. The mirrors on the walls seemed to close in, reflecting our faces back at us, distorted, fragmented, haunted. I didn't know what was coming next, but one thing was certain. Whatever this reunion was, it had nothing to do with nostalgia. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant creaks of the building settling. Whitaker stood still, his expression unreadable, as if waiting for the weight of his words to settle on us. One by one, the group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one dared to speak. "What test?" Carla finally asked, her voice shaky but defiant. Whitaker smiled, a cold, calculated expression that didn't reach his eyes. "The test of truth," he replied. "The things we bury don't stay buried forever. Tonight, we'll dig them up together." A sudden buzz echoed through the room. A projector descended from the ceiling, casting a beam of light onto one of the mirrored walls. The surface shimmered, transforming into a screen. It flickered, and then an image appeared, an old yearbook photo. It was Emily. Her face smiled out at us, frozen in time. I heard Marcus inhale sharply beside me. A wave of unease rippled through the group as the image changed, switching to a candid photo of her at a party, then another of her walking through the school halls. Emily, Rachel whispered, her voice barely audible. You remember her, don't you? Whitaker's tone was casual, almost conversational, but there was an edge to it that set my teeth on edge. The girl who disappeared. The girl no one bothered to look for. That's not true, Rachel snapped, her voice rising. We cared. We cared? Whitaker cut her off with a chuckle. Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night? Before she could respond, the screen changed again. This time, it showed a video, grainy and shaky, as if recorded on an old phone. The camera panned across a wooded area, its lens catching glimpses of figures moving between the trees. My stomach tightened as I recognized them. Us. The voices on the recording were muffled but unmistakable. Laughter, drunken banter, and then a scream. Turn it off, Marcus muttered, stepping forward. What the hell is this? Whitaker ignored him. The footage continued, showing Emily stumbling through the woods, her face pale with fear. The camera followed her until she stopped abruptly, staring at something off-screen. The final frame was a blur of movement before the video cut to static. What did you do to her? Carla demanded, her voice trembling. Whitaker tilted his head, his expression amused. Me? Oh no, I wasn't there. But you were. The accusation hung in the air like a noose. This is insane, James said, backing away. That was years ago. None of us... Do you really believe that? Whitaker interrupted, his voice sharp now. That you're innocent? That your silence didn't condemn her just as much as the hands that pushed her into the dark? I felt the weight of his words settle over me. Memories I'd tried to forget resurfaced with brutal clarity. The party, the laughter, the way we'd all ignored Emily's pleas for help that night. I hadn't been directly involved, but I hadn't stopped it either. I didn't do anything, I muttered, though the words felt hollow. That's precisely the problem, Whitaker said, turning his gaze to me. None of you did. The room grew colder, the mirrors around us reflecting our guilt back at us. I could see it in their faces, the cracks forming in the facades we'd built over the years. Carla's defiance faltered, Rachel's tears began to fall, and even Marcus looked shaken. What do you want from us? I asked, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Whitaker stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor like a creeping tide. I want the truth, he said. Not for me, but for her. The lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When they returned, the screen displayed a countdown. Go 59, 59. 1 hour, Whitaker announced. To confess, to reveal what really happened that night. Or this place will bury your secrets forever. Panic rippled through the group, but I forced myself to stay calm. This wasn't just a game. It was a reckoning. And somehow I knew that Whitaker wasn't bluffing. Start talking, Marcus said, his voice firm but urgent. If anyone knows something, now's the time. The room fell into chaos as voices overlapped, accusations flying like daggers. The walls seemed to close in, the mirrors reflecting not just our faces, but something darker. Shadows of the people we used to be. I stayed silent, my mind racing. This wasn't just about Emily. It was about all of us. And if we didn't find the truth before the clock ran out, I had a feeling none of us would be leaving the glass hall alive. The countdown loomed over us like a guillotine. 59:42, 59:41. Every second ticked by, chipping away at whatever thin composure the group had left. Accusations flew fast and vicious. You were with her last, Carla. Rachel's voice cracked as she jabbed a trembling finger at her former friend. You dragged her out of the house when she was drunk, Carla scoffed, though her face had paled. Dragged her out? She wanted to leave. She said she couldn't stand being around. All of you. Convenient excuse, Marcus interjected. You had beef with Emily for years. Don't act like you were trying to help. Carla's veneer of confidence shattered. I was scared, okay? She snapped. She was ranting about things, about someone watching her. She was paranoid. I thought she just needed air, but she bolted into the woods and You left her there, I said quietly, my voice cutting through the chaos. Carla looked at me, her eyes wide. I didn't think she wouldn't come back. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on all of us. On the mirrored walls, our reflections seemed to shimmer, warped by some unseen force. The building wasn't just amplifying our guilt, it was feeding on it. "I saw her run too," James admitted, his usual bravado gone. "But I didn't follow. I figured she'd come back when she cooled off." "That's it?" Marcus snarled. "You figured?" She was terrified. "And where were you, Marcus?" I asked sharply. "You were at the party. You saw her leave too, didn't you?" Marcus's jaw tightened. He avoided my gaze, his hands clenched into fists. "I didn't think it was my problem. I thought—" He trailed off, his voice hollow. "You thought she deserved it," Rachel finished, her voice thick with disgust. "No," Marcus shot back, but the look on his face betrayed him. He'd always had a cruel streak, the kind that thrived on other people's misfortunes. The clock ticked on. 47:03, 47:02. Whitaker stood silently by the screen, his expression unreadable but watchful. "What happened after she ran?" I pressed, trying to piece together the fragments of the night. "Someone must have gone after her." The group exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Then Rachel, her voice trembling, said, I heard a scream." All eyes turned to her. "I thought it was just a joke," she whispered, her hands wringing together. "You know how people would play pranks at those parties. I didn't think it was real." "But it was," I said, dread pooling in my stomach. Rachel nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't go look. I didn't want to get involved." The silence that followed was suffocating. We'd all heard the scream that night, but we'd ignored it, chalking it up to drunken antics, to someone else's problem. And now, years later, the consequences of that inaction were closing in on us. The mirrors on the wall shifted again, the reflections growing darker, more distorted. Emily's face appeared among them, flickering in and out like a ghost haunting the edges of our vision. "I didn't hurt her," Marcus said suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was frantic now, desperate. "None of us did. She ran, that's it." "But none of us stopped her," I said. "None of us did anything to help." The screen behind Whitaker flickered to life again, showing another video. This one was clearer, more recent. It showed a shallow grave freshly dug with a small wooden cross marking the site. "This is where she rests," Whitaker said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Not because she deserved it, but because you allowed it." Carla collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Rachel covered her face, her shoulders shaking. Even Marcus, defiant to the last, looked ready to break. "Is there anything we can do?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Whitaker's gaze turned to me, his eyes cold and unyielding. "There's always a choice, redemption or ruin. But it comes at a price." "What price?" I demanded. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the mirrored walls. One by one, the reflections began to shift, showing versions of ourselves that were darker, crueler, more broken. They were the people we might have become if we didn't face the truth. The clock hit 00:10. "We confess," I said firmly, stepping forward. "We own what we did. All of it." The others stared at me, their expressions a mix of fear and resignation. One by one, they nodded, and together we began to speak. We told the truth about Emily, about that night, about the choices that had led to her death. With every word, the room seemed to grow brighter, the shadows retreating. The mirrors returned to their original state, reflecting only our exhausted, tear-streaked faces. When the clock hit 00, Whitaker smiled faintly. "You passed," he said simply, and then he was gone. The doors creaked open, revealing the cold night beyond. Without a word, we stumbled out into the fresh air, the weight of the past finally lifting. But as we drove away, one thought lingered in my mind. Not all ghosts haunt in death. Some haunt in life, in the choices we make, and the regrets we carry. Story number 2. There's something about a park at night that defies explanation. It's serene yet unnerving, like the world itself has paused just to let you breathe in the quiet. I've always found solace in that stillness. As the narrator of my own stories, I often lose myself in moments like these where the only company is the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the city. But tonight wasn't like any other night. The bench beneath me creaked as I shifted my weight, my notebook open on my lap. I was scrawling notes for a future story when the oppressive quiet suddenly felt off. I glanced around, my eyes catching the moonlight filtering through skeletal branches. That's when I noticed something unusual. The air was dense, as if the atmosphere itself were leaning in to listen. "Hey, park's closed," a gruff voice shattered the silence. Startled, I looked up to see a park guard, his flashlight piercing the darkness. He was a familiar figure, someone I'd seen countless times during my late-night escapes. But his tone tonight carried something different, an edge that put me on guard. "Sorry about that," I said, standing and brushing the frost from my coat. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, stepping closer. His face was partially illuminated, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something strange in his eyes, something beyond the ordinary. I nodded, unwilling to argue. As I made my way down the dimly lit path, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still watching me, his flashlight a spectral eye tracking my every move. The walk home was uneventful at first, though the park's eerie silence seemed to follow me. The familiar rhythm of my steps should have been comforting, but instead, it felt hollow. As I reached the edge of the park, the lamplights ahead seemed dimmer than usual. Their golden glow barely lit the road, casting elongated shadows that twisted like something alive. I kept walking, but unease began to build. The neighborhood I'd known for years felt strange. Fences seemed taller, houses darker, and the air itself seemed thicker. The cold bit deeper with each step, and the streetlights behind me flickered ominously. Then I noticed the whispers, faint at first, like the wind sifting through dry leaves. But these weren't natural sounds. They were layered, overlapping, and just beyond the edge of comprehension. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear, but the moment I tried to focus, the whispers ceased. "Just my imagination," I muttered, trying to convince myself. But as I turned the corner, something truly unnerving happened. The street ahead was gone. Instead of familiar houses and sidewalks, there was only a long, barren stretch of ground covered in something gray and shifting, almost like ash. The trees lining the road seemed to lean inward, their skeletal branches reaching for me as if beckoning. I hesitated, unsure whether to move forward or turn back. The whispers returned, louder now, their tones weaving together into a low hum that pressed against my thoughts. It wasn't just sound, it was weight pressing into my chest, forcing me to acknowledge its presence. The streetlights flickered again, and this time they went out completely. The world was plunged into darkness, save for the pale moonlight that barely illuminated the ash-covered ground. I took a cautious step forward, the crunch beneath my boots unfamiliar and unsettling. "Hello," I called out, my voice firm but curious. There was no answer, only the wind and the trees swaying unnaturally in the distance. I glanced back, expecting to see the park's entrance or the street I'd just left, but it was gone, swallowed by the same oppressive darkness that now surrounded me. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt a peculiar mix of dread and determination. If this was some cruel trick of the mind or a dream I couldn't wake from, I needed answers. Taking another step forward, I tightened my grip on my notebook, as if it were a talisman against whatever was watching me from the shadows. The ground beneath my boots felt wrong. It wasn't the familiar crunch of gravel or frost. This was softer, like a carpet of decay hidden beneath the ash-like dust. I moved cautiously, scanning my surroundings for something, anything, that would anchor me to reality. It was eerily quiet now, the whispers having faded into an oppressive silence. I thought about turning back, but the path behind me had dissolved into the same gray expanse. It was as though the world itself had shifted, leaving me stranded in a liminal space that didn't belong to the city or anywhere I recognized. Ahead, a faint glow emerged from the horizon, flickering like the last ember of a dying fire. It wasn't warm or inviting. It was cold and clinical, like a faulty fluorescent bulb. Despite every instinct telling me to stay away, I walked toward it, the unnatural quiet weighing heavier with each step. As I approached, the glow revealed its source, a single street lamp standing in the middle of the path. It flickered erratically, casting jittery shadows that danced like specters on the surrounding trees. Beneath it stood a bench, much like the one I had been sitting on earlier. Curiosity and unease warred within me. I stepped closer, my breaths visible in the freezing air. The bench looked out of place, its wooden slats worn and weathered. On its surface, scratched into the peeling paint, was a message. "Don't stay long." A chill that wasn't from the cold settled in my chest. I ran my fingers over the etching, its rough edges suggesting it was carved in haste. Who had left it? And why? My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Behind me, a faint sound broke the silence, a crunch of ash beneath hurried steps. I turned sharply, but there was nothing, only the shifting shadows cast by the flickering light. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cutting through the stillness. No response, just the faint echo of my own words. I stepped away from the bench, my movements careful and deliberate. That's when I saw it, a figure at the edge of the light's reach, just far enough to be indistinct. They stood still, facing me, but their features were obscured by the darkness. "Hello," I said, my tone steady despite the unease clawing at my gut. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, a silhouette against the oppressive gray. The seconds stretched into an eternity, and then, without warning, it stepped closer, just enough for the light to catch the edge of its profile. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. His clothes were tattered, his face gaunt, and his eyes. There was something off about them. Not glowing or inhuman, but empty, as though whatever spark made him a person had long since burned out. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low and rasping like he hadn't used it in years. "I know," I replied, gripping my notebook tightly. "I was just leaving." The man tilted his head as though considering my words. "They don't like visitors," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not this late." "Who's they?" I asked, stepping back instinctively. His gaze snapped to mine, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of fear in his hollow eyes. "Go," he said, his tone sharper now. "Don't ask questions. Just go." I didn't need to be told twice. Turning on my heel, I started walking back the way I came, but the man's voice called after me, stopping me in my tracks. "They'll know if you hesitate," he warned. "Don't look back." I glanced over my shoulder despite myself, but the man was gone. The bench, the light, even the etched warning, all of it had vanished, replaced by the endless stretch of gray ash and barren trees. I quickened my pace, my breaths shallow and rapid. The path twisted ahead of me, unfamiliar and unending. Every so often I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing, only my own shadow stretching unnaturally in the dim light. Panic began to bubble beneath my surface calm, but I forced it down. Fear wasn't going to help me here. I needed to think, to focus. Somewhere in this twisted landscape was an exit. There had to be. The path split ahead, dividing into two equally bleak directions. I hesitated, trying to discern some clue as to which way would lead me back to reality. That's when I heard it again, the faint sound of footsteps. This time they were coming from both paths. The crossroads loomed before me, both paths equally bleak and suffocating. The sound of footsteps, deliberate and synchronized, echoed from each direction, as though the paths themselves were alive, teasing me with the illusion of choice. My pulse pounded in my ears, but I refused to stand frozen. Action was better than paralysis. I chose the left path, guided not by logic but by instinct, a strange pull, like the faint tug of a current beneath still waters. The ash-coated ground gave way to a rougher terrain, scattered with jagged rocks that seemed to glint faintly in the dim light. Each step echoed unnaturally loud, as though the space around me amplified even the smallest sound. The footsteps behind me grew louder. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. Whoever or whatever it was, they weren't rushing. They didn't need to. "You keep moving," I muttered to myself, clenching my notebook tightly. My voice felt alien in the oppressive silence, but it kept me tethered, kept my thoughts from spiraling. The trees around me leaned closer, their barren branches forming a canopy that shut out even the faintest glimmers of light. The path narrowed, forcing me to step carefully to avoid twisting an ankle on the uneven ground. The air grew colder, each breath sharp and biting, and then I saw it. A figure seated on a boulder ahead, their silhouette illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. My footsteps faltered as I approached. The figure turned toward me, their face shadowed but unmistakably human. "You're not supposed to be here," the man said, his voice weary but firm. His clothes were old, frayed at the edges, and his posture was hunched, as though he'd been sitting there for centuries. "Neither are you," I replied, my voice steady despite the knot tightening in my chest. The man let out a dry chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "I don't have a choice. You do." "Then help me," I said. "How do I get out of here?" His expression darkened, his eyes glinting with something between pity and regret. "This place doesn't let go easily. It feeds on hesitation, on fear." "That's not an answer," I shot back, frustration edging into my tone. The man stood, his movement slow and deliberate. He gestured toward a narrow opening in the trees to the right of the path. "Go that way. Don't stop. Don't look back." "Why should I trust you?" "You shouldn't," he said simply. "But staying here isn't an option." I weighed his words, glancing toward the path he indicated. It was even darker than the one I was on, the trees so densely packed they seemed to form a tunnel. But the man's eyes held a sincerity that made me pause. "Good luck," he added, his tone flat. Without another word, I started toward the narrow path, my steps quickening as the oppressive atmosphere seemed to close in. The whispers returned, louder this time, their tones sharper, more insistent. The path twisted and turned, narrowing further until I was practically squeezing between the trees. The ground beneath me felt uneven, almost shifting, but I pushed forward. The air was thicker now, each breath harder to draw. Then, out of nowhere, a scream shattered the silence. It wasn't distant or faint, it was close, too close, and raw with terror. I froze, my body instinctively tensing. The scream came again, and this time, it was followed by the unmistakable sound of something crashing through the underbrush. My heart pounded as I debated whether to keep moving or investigate. The scream sounded human, desperate. If someone was in danger, could I really just walk away? But the man's warning echoed in my mind. "Don't stop. Don't look back." I gritted my teeth and forced myself to move, each step heavier than the last. The crashing sounds grew louder, closer, but I refused to turn around. My grip on the notebook tightened, its pages damp with sweat from my trembling hands. The path suddenly opened into a clearing. In its center was a decrepit wooden signpost, its lettering faded and unreadable. Behind it, a road stretched into the distance, lined with streetlights that flickered erratically. Salvation or another trick? I hesitated, the screams and crashing still echoing behind me. Time was slipping away, the oppressive weight of the place threatening to consume me. With one last glance at the signpost, I stepped onto the road, hoping it would lead me back to something familiar. The road stretched endlessly before me, flanked by flickering streetlights that seemed more unreliable with each step. The faint hum of electricity buzzing through the bulbs was the only sound, replacing the eerie whispers that had haunted me before. Still, the silence felt unnatural, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I kept moving, my boots crunching against the gravel. My eyes darted between the shadows that danced on the edges of my vision. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, but I didn't stop. Every step forward was a rebellion against the oppressive weight of this place. Ahead, the road curved sharply, and I saw what looked like a familiar landmark, a rusted lamppost leaning precariously to one side. Relief flooded through me. I'd passed it on my way into the park earlier. But as I approached, something was off. The graffiti scrawled across the base wasn't the same, and the lamppost seemed taller, more imposing. The rusted metal twisted in ways that didn't feel natural, almost as if it had been warped by something far stronger than time or weather. "You're not out yet." The voice made me freeze mid-step. It was the same rasping tone as before, but when I turned, the man from the boulder wasn't there. Instead, I saw someone else, a young woman, her face pale and gaunt, standing beneath one of the dim streetlights. She looked out of place, her clothes modern yet torn, her expression weary. "You thought this would be easy?" she asked, stepping closer. Her voice was quiet but carried a sharpness that demanded attention. "I'm just trying to get home," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Home," she let out a bitter laugh. That's not how this works. You took the wrong turn the moment you hesitated." "I didn't hesitate," I snapped, the words coming out harsher than I intended. She tilted her head, studying me with an unnerving intensity. "Maybe not with your feet, but in here?" She pointed to her temple. "This place doesn't just follow you, it becomes you. The longer you stay, the more it knows." "What do you mean?" I demanded. She didn't answer. Instead, she gestured toward the road behind me. "You don't have much time. If you're lucky, you'll make it out before it gets too dark." I hesitated, glancing back the way I'd come. The road was already fading into the gray, as if the world were being erased behind me. "Go!" she shouted, and this time there was urgency in her tone. I ran. The road beneath me felt like it was shifting, the gravel turning softer, almost like quicksand. I kept moving, my breath sharp and labored. The streetlights flickered wildly, casting shadows that twisted and writhed across the path. Suddenly, I saw a break in the road ahead, a clearing that looked unmistakably like the park's entrance. The familiar iron gates stood wide open, their rusted hinges creaking faintly in the wind. Beyond them, the streetlights of the city glowed faintly, their warmth a stark contrast to the cold emptiness of the road behind me. I pushed myself harder, my legs burning as I sprinted toward the gates. Just as I reached them, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, and I stumbled, falling hard onto the gravel. When I looked up, the woman was there again, standing just inside the gates. "This is your last chance," she said softly. "If you turn back, you'll never leave." "I'm not turning back," I said, my voice firm. She gave a faint smile, almost sad. "Good." I scrambled to my feet and ran through the gates, my heart pounding in my chest. As I crossed into the city, the oppressive weight of the place behind me lifted, replaced by the familiar sounds of cars and distant voices. I turned back once just to see if it was real, but the park was gone. Where the gates had stood was now an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and lit only by a single, flickering street lamp. I stood there for a long moment trying to make sense of what had happened, but no matter how I turned it over in my mind, there was no logical explanation. I didn't go back to the park after that night. I didn't need to. Whatever I'd encountered there had left its mark, a scar carved deep into my memory. But one thing stuck with me the most, what the woman had said about hesitation. Sometimes the choices we make don't just change the path we walk, they change the person we become. Story number 3. The air that night was heavy, pregnant with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The festival had been whispered about for weeks, slipping through the cracks of our small-town conversations like an unwelcome draft. I remember the letter, as if it were still in my hands. It arrived in a crimson envelope sealed with black wax, a relic of another time. My name, scrawled in a jagged hand, was the only thing on its surface. No sender, no address, just me. "Is this some kind of joke?" I muttered, turning the letter over in my hands as I sat on the porch of my home. The soft creak of the wooden swing beneath me felt like the only sound in the world. "Who's it from?" my friend Alex asked, leaning against the railing with a bottle of beer in hand. His voice carried that easy humor he always wore, but his eyes, those were uneasy. "Doesn't say." I cracked the wax seal, feeling the brittle snap against my fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, its edges singed as though it had been pulled from a fire. It read, "Under the light of the blood moon, come to the clearing where shadows dance. Bring no light, for it will not save you." Alex chuckled, though it sounded hollow. Someone's got too much time on their hands. Halloween prank, maybe? But it wasn't Halloween. It wasn't even close. The blood moon was set to rise that weekend, the first in over 3 decades. The kind of thing that stirred up old stories and superstitions. The kind most of us laughed off, though not entirely without unease. That night, as the moon crawled higher into the sky, its light bleeding red through the thin curtain of clouds, the town felt different. The usual warmth of streetlights and murmured laughter was replaced by a silence that wrapped around you, making you feel watched. "I'm going," I told Alex the next evening, gripping the letter tighter than I meant to. "You're serious?" His face twisted into a mix of disbelief and concern. "This is how horror movies start, man. I shrugged. Then maybe this is how one ends. The truth? I wasn't sure why I was going. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the strange pull that letter had on me, like a thread sewn into my very skin. Or maybe it was the gnawing feeling that this, whatever this was, wasn't meant to be ignored. Alex reluctantly agreed to join me. Someone's got to keep you from getting eaten by witches or whatever. The clearing wasn't far, just beyond the edge of town where the forest thickened. The path, familiar during the day, felt alien under the blood moon. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, curling like fingers around the trees. When we reached the clearing, the air seemed to hum. At its center was a massive bonfire, though no one stood near it. Figures in black cloaks ringed the fire instead, their faces hidden beneath cowls. "Welcome," one of them said, their voice low and cold. "You've answered the call." "What is this?" Alex demanded, stepping forward. The figure didn't respond, but I noticed the way their head tilted as though studying us. That's when I saw it, beneath their hood, the glint of something not quite human in their eyes. And then the chanting began. The chanting was low at first, like the distant hum of an approaching storm. The cloaked figures moved closer to the bonfire, their steps deliberate, almost rhythmic. Alex and I exchanged a glance, the kind that didn't need words. Something about this felt staged, but too carefully choreographed to be a prank. "Let's go," Alex whispered, his voice tight. "Wait." My curiosity clung to me like a weight. My eyes scanned the clearing, and that's when I noticed it. A wooden table near the fire, crudely built but sturdy. On it lay something wrapped in burlap, long and bulky like a rolled-up rug. The figure closest to the table reached out, unwrapping the bundle with reverence. A knife gleamed in the firelight, old and worn, its edge jagged like it had been used for purposes no one dared to imagine. Beneath the cloth was a mask, carved from some dark wood, its features grotesque and unsettling. "This is a tradition," the figure intoned, their voice rising above the others. "A sacrifice to the blood moon, as our ancestors taught us. One to protect the land, to secure the harvest." "Sacrifice?" Alex's voice broke the eerie silence. He took a step forward, his posture shifting to one of defiance. "This isn't funny. Who are you people?" The cloaked figure ignored him, lifting the mask and turning it to face us. Its hollow eyes seemed to pull at me, a strange unease curling in my stomach. "I'm leaving," Alex muttered, grabbing my arm. But I couldn't move, not yet. "Stop." My voice was firm. "What kind of sacrifice are you talking about?" The figure's head tilted again, almost as if amused. "The kind that binds. The kind that ensures survival." The chanting resumed, louder now, and the bonfire flared. Alex pulled at me again, his grip insistent. "We're not sticking around for this." That's when I heard it, a sound just beyond the clearing, not an animal, not the wind. It was low, guttural, like someone struggling to breathe. My head snapped toward the sound, and I caught a glimpse of movement among the trees. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice sharper than I intended. The chanting faltered, and all heads turned in unison toward the trees. The atmosphere shifted, the cloaked figures suddenly tense. "Stay where you are," one of them hissed, breaking their formation and heading toward the tree line. "No way," Alex muttered, yanking me harder. This time I let him lead. As we turned back toward the path, the chanting stopped completely, replaced by muffled cries, the kind that didn't belong in any ritual I'd ever heard of. We ran, our feet pounding against the dirt path. The forest seemed to close in around us, the branches overhead twisting like skeletal fingers. My breath came in sharp bursts, and I realized I still had the letter clutched in my hand. When we finally reached the road, the weight of what we'd seen began to settle. Alex bent over, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. "What? What the hell was that?" "I don't know." My voice felt foreign to me, hollow. We stood there for a moment, the silence of the night pressing in, but the questions gnawed at me. What were those figures doing? What was the mask for? And more importantly, what or who was in the woods? "Let's just get back," Alex said, his tone unsteady. As we walked, the stillness of the night returned, but it was the wrong kind of quiet, the kind that crawls under your skin. When we reached my porch, I noticed something that hadn't been there before. Another crimson envelope. This time it wasn't sealed. Inside was a photograph, old and faded, of a group of people standing in the same clearing we had just left. At the center of the group stood a man in the grotesque mask, holding something small and lifeless in his arms. On the back of the photo, in the same jagged handwriting, were 3 words: "You were chosen." The photograph weighed heavy in my hand, as though the truth it held carried a physical burden. Alex paced the porch, his steps loud against the wooden planks. "This isn't some weird prank anymore," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "Who leaves something like that? How the hell do they even know where you live?" I didn't answer. My eyes were locked on the photograph, tracing the distorted face of the masked figure. The longer I stared, the more unsettling it became. The mask wasn't just grotesque, it was familiar, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. "We should call the cops," Alex said, finally breaking the silence. "And tell them what?" I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. "That we went to some creepy ritual and now someone's leaving us old photos? You think they'll take that seriously?" Alex stopped pacing and turned to face me. "So what's your plan? Sit here and wait for them to leave another gift? Or worse?" I didn't have a plan. Not a good one anyway. But something about this was personal. The letter, the clearing, the photograph, none of it felt random. "I need to figure out who they are," I said, my voice quieter now. "Why they picked me." "Figure it out? Are you insane?" Alex threw his hands in the air. "You don't go chasing things like this. You walk away. You let it go." But I couldn't let it go. That night, I spread the photograph and the letter on the kitchen table, scrutinizing every detail. The photo looked like it was taken decades ago. The clothing of the people in it was outdated, and the edges of the picture were worn and frayed. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. A name etched faintly in the corner of the photograph: Raven's Hollow. The name sparked something in me. I'd heard it before, though only in passing. It was a stretch of land on the outskirts of town, abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. I called Alex the next morning. "Don't even say it," he said the moment he picked up. "If you're thinking about going there, I'm out." "You don't have to come," I replied, slipping the photograph into my jacket pocket. "I need to do this." "Need?" His voice was incredulous. "You don't need to do anything except stay alive, but fine. Do what you want. Just don't expect me to pull you out of whatever mess you find." By the time I reached Raven's Hollow, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows over the empty expanse. The land was overgrown, wild grass swallowing the remnants of old fences and buildings. At the center of it all was a weathered barn, its roof sagging and walls leaning as though it were too tired to stand. I approached cautiously, the silence pressing in around me. The door creaked open with little resistance, revealing a space that was both empty and suffocating. Dust particles floated in the fading light, and the smell of decay clung to the air. At first, it seemed like nothing was there, just broken furniture and scattered debris. But then I saw it, tucked in the far corner of the barn, a small wooden box, its lid carved with the same grotesque mask from the photograph. My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of letters, each one written in the same jagged handwriting. The top letter read, "The blood moon binds us all. The chosen must carry the weight." Before I could read further, I heard it, a faint creak of wood behind me. My heart slammed in my chest as I turned, expecting to see Alex or maybe even one of the cloaked figures. But the doorway was empty. I stepped outside, scanning the overgrown field. Nothing moved, but the air carried a tension that made every nerve in my body scream. And then I saw them. In the distance, just beyond the tree line, stood 3 figures, their black cloaks unmistakable. They didn't move, didn't come closer. They simply watched. I didn't wait to see what they'd do next. I ran, the photograph and letters clutched tightly in my hands. By the time I reached my house, night had fallen, and Alex was waiting on the porch. "I thought you said you weren't coming," I said, breathless. "I changed my mind." He frowned, taking in my disheveled state. "What happened?" I handed him the letters, my hands still shaking. "They're watching us, Alex. They're not done." The room was dark, except for the dim glow of the desk lamp. The letters lay sprawled out in front of us like a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Alex leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face a mask of unease. "They're not just watching," I said finally. "They're waiting." "For what?" Alex shot back, his voice sharp. "For you to figure out their cryptic little messages, or for you to walk right into their trap?" I didn't answer. My mind was stuck on the last letter I'd read. "To defy the blood moon is to invite ruin. The chosen must answer or all will suffer." The words burned in my head. I thought about the figures in the clearing, the eerie chanting, and the photograph of the masked man holding that lifeless bundle. There was no question anymore. This wasn't a prank. "I think they want me to go back," I said, my voice barely above a murmur. Alex slammed his hand on the table, making the letters flutter. "And do what? Offer yourself up? This is insane, and you know it." "I don't know what else to do," I snapped, standing so quickly my chair screeched against the floor. "If I don't go, if I ignore this, what happens then? Do they come after us? After our families?" The weight of my words hung in the air. For once, Alex didn't have a snappy comeback. After a long silence, he sighed. "If you're going, I'm going with you. But if this goes sideways, we're out. No heroics." "Deal," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. The drive to Raven's Hollow felt different this time. The road seemed narrower, the trees denser. The blood moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in an eerie crimson glow. By the time we reached the barn, my nerves were raw. The figures were already there, standing in a line just outside the structure. No fire this time, no chanting, just silence. "You've come," one of them said, their voice cold and detached. "I need answers," I said, stepping forward. Alex stayed close, his hand gripping something in his pocket. A knife, maybe, or some other desperate weapon. The figure tilted their head, their hidden face unreadable. "The answers are in the ritual. Only then will you understand." "What ritual?" Alex interjected, his voice laced with defiance. The figure didn't respond, but instead gestured toward the barn. Inside, the wooden table stood in the center, and atop it was the mask. "You must wear it," the figure said. "Only then can the bond be sealed." "No way," Alex said, stepping in front of me. "This is some cult nonsense. We're not playing along." But I was already moving, drawn to the mask like a moth to a flame. My fingers brushed its surface, rough and splintered. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. The figure's response was chilling. "The blood moon demands balance. If the chosen does not answer, the void will take another." "Another what?" Alex demanded. "Another life," the figure said simply. A sickening realization hit me. This wasn't about me, it was about everyone else. The choice was mine, but the consequences would ripple far beyond this moment. I turned to Alex, my chest tightening. "I think I have to do this." "No." He grabbed my arm, his eyes wide with panic. "This isn't your responsibility. They're manipulating you. We can fight this, together." But deep down, I knew there was no fighting this. The weight of generations pressed down on me, the stories, the warnings, the rituals. This wasn't just about belief, it was about survival. I pulled free from Alex's grip and lifted the mask. It was heavier than I expected, its interior cool against my skin. As I placed it over my face, the world shifted. The barn disappeared, replaced by a swirling void of shadows and whispers. Images flashed before me. Faces I didn't recognize, lives I hadn't lived, all tied to the blood moon. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. I was back in the barn, the figures gone. Alex stood frozen, his face pale. "What just happened?" "I don't know," I admitted, pulling the mask off and setting it on the table. "But it's over." The drive home was quiet, the silence heavy with unspoken questions. I didn't know if we'd stopped whatever this was or if we'd only delayed it. But as the blood moon faded from the sky, a strange calm settled over me. Maybe the bond had been sealed, or maybe it had just begun.